In 2005, the Phoenix Police Department, the capital of Arizona in the United States, was enduring one of its most stressful periods. At the same time, several serial killers were operating within their jurisdiction, robbing, raping, and murdering women, men, and even domestic animals. Mark Gudo was a native of Phoenix, born on September 6, 1964, into a family from the lower class. He had 14 brothers and sisters, and Mark was the youngest of them. Some sources report that the Gudo family had problems with prohibited substances, although not all of them went down the wrong path. Many became good and hardworking people. Mark's mother died when he was 12 years old, while he was traveling to his older sister's place. He attended middle school where he played American football, though not as successfully as his older brother Michael. In high school, due to financial difficulties, Mark Gudo was forced to start working. Subsequently, the boy lost interest in his studies, and because of poor academic performance, he was compelled to drop out of school in 1982, shortly before completing the 12th grade. That same year, a girl contacted the police, claiming that throughout 1981, Mark and his brother Michael had repeatedly raped her in her own home. However, during the investigation, the police established that the girl led an antisocial lifestyle and had voluntarily engaged in intimate relations with the brothers. As a result, her testimony was called into question. No charges were brought against Mark Gudo, and the girl soon left Phoenix. But this was only the beginning. At the age of 23, Mark Gudo was arrested for unlawful entry into a dwelling. A year later, for driving under the influence. At the age of 25, he was charged with sexual assault and attempted second-degree murder. The victim's identity was not disclosed, but in the press, she was referred to as Darlene. Early in the morning on August 6, 1989, the police responded to a call from people who reported that a man was beating a woman with the butt of a rifle in a parking lot. The woman was in a semi-conscious state. The arriving officers found Darlene topless and with a bleeding head. Eyewitnesses said they had seen a certain man leaving and that he had an additional revolver. The woman was hospitalized with a fractured skull, deep lacerations, and hematomas all over her body. When she was able to give a statement 3 days later, she said that the attacker was Mark Gudo and provided her address. Darlene said they were acquainted, and that while in her apartment, Mark had repeatedly beaten her, thrown her into the bathtub, and tried to drown her, but she managed to escape, and the attacker pursued her to the parking lot. The police arrested Gudo, who claimed that he had engaged in consensual sexual relations with Darlene. He said that 2 armed men, one of whom had an automatic weapon, had beaten her and left, and that he had helped the woman get to her grandmother's house. When the men returned and beat her again, they fled. Of course, no one believed him. Mark faced decades in prison, but a series of errors and judicial leniencies allowed him to secure a plea deal in which Gudo pleaded guilty to multiple counts of aggravated assault, with the charges of dangerous conduct dropped. This enabled him to be eligible for parole after 1 year. When he was supposed to be sentenced, Gudo, who inexplicably was still at large, robbed a supermarket and, using a silver pistol, which would be described in several other cases, forced employees to escort him to his car. But this scene was witnessed by many people, who alerted the authorities, providing the model's license plate number. Soon, officers detained Mark in his vehicle along with the stolen money. One might think that the armed robbery and kidnapping charges would be added to the existing ones against Darlene, resulting in a much harsher sentence. But in reality, in the rape case, the judge sentenced Mark to 15 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 10 years. In the second case, again thanks to a plea deal, he was sentenced to only 4 years. After 13 years in prison, on March 8, 2004, Mark Gudo appeared before the state parole board. It was established that he had behaved well in prison and completed several self-help programs. Additionally, the inmate had married a woman named Wendy Carr, with whom he had lived before his incarceration. At the hearings, Wendy and a prison activist spoke in Gudo's favor, stating that the cause of his bad behavior had been alcohol and prohibited substances. In the end, the commission, which held the decision in its hands, voted 4-1 in favor of Mark Gudo's early release. Mark and Wendy began living together again to start a new life away from crime. According to available information, the man got a job as a laborer in a large construction company, where he was considered a diligent worker and was very popular among his colleagues. The married couple's life and society in the area in general was developing normally. But a series of crimes began threatening the peace of Phoenix residents. On August 6, 2005, 3 teenage girls were attacked by an armed man who forced them behind a church near a road called Baseline Road, where he assaulted 2 of them. This marked the beginning of a long list of crimes that would keep the city's public on high alert in the following months, with law enforcement in tense pursuit. A week later, on August 14th, another sexual assault was reported, in which the victim's belongings were stolen. 3 weeks later, in early September, the murder of a young woman named Georgia Thompson, only 19 years old, was registered. Her body was found with her shirt unbuttoned, pants unbuttoned, and a gunshot wound to the head. Her wallet was never found. Another sexual assault occurred on September 15th. And just 5 days later, 2 young sisters walking home from a park became new victims. One of the girls was pregnant, but that didn't stop the man from attacking them and, at gunpoint, forcing them to move to a secluded spot, where he raped the younger sister while holding the pistol to the pregnant sister's stomach. On September 28, 2005, 2 separate crimes were reported: a robbery and a sexual assault with robbery. In the following days, weeks, and months, the crimes continued to pile up in a mix of sexual assaults and robberies. The incidents were recorded within a radius close to Baseline Road, so the unknown perpetrator became known as the Baseline Rapist. On November 3rd and 7th, numerous crimes were committed. On November 3rd at 8 p.m., a robbery was recorded, and nearby, 9 minutes later, a sexual assault. That same day, a man described as dark-skinned with dreadlocks and wearing a fishing hat entered a store, threatened with a pistol, and stole $720. Less than 10 minutes later, a report came in that a man in a Halloween mask and large glasses had committed sexual assault on a girl who was donating items to a collection bin. After the assault, the perpetrator demanded that the victim drive him around the corner because he had just committed a robbery. For days later, the mysterious man robbed 11 people between restaurants on the same street. After the last robbery, the criminal fired into the air. The bullet casing was recovered. But on December 12th, the already dire situation only worsened. That night, Phoenix homicide detectives were called to the scene where a woman's body was discovered behind a warehouse. The arriving investigators found the woman's body lying face up in a pool of blood. She had been shot twice in the head at close range. She had no wallet or documents, only a shopping bag with a Christmas design. A man contacted the police, saying he might have seen the killer. His name was Pete Aco, and he worked at that very warehouse where, according to him, there was a fast food spot behind which the body was found. Pete said he heard a knock at the back door and thought neighborhood kids were playing soccer. Aco went outside to shoo them away and saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt leaning over the motionless body. The hooded man also saw Aco. He stood up and pointed his silver pistol at the worker, fired, but the gun misfired. Pete immediately ran and locked himself inside the warehouse. At the scene, investigators found 2 spent .38 caliber bullet casings and an intact bullet that had missed Pete Aco. The next day, through fingerprints, authorities established that the victim was 39-year-old Tina Washington, who worked at a daycare center from which she was leaving when she was attacked. Authorities notified Tina's family and asked one of her adult sons if his mother wore any jewelry. The grief-stricken young man replied that she wore a very unusual ring, with the names of her 3 children engraved next to each stone. One of the detectives recalled that a notice had been circulated in the police department about a man committing sexual assaults and robberies of women in the Baseline Road area. He wondered if there was a connection between this and other cases. In early 2006, the Phoenix police formed a special task force of experienced detectives to investigate these cases and assigned about 100 street officers for ongoing support. The police released a composite sketch of a man with dreadlocks and a fishing hat, based on victim statements. The sketch was disseminated through all media outlets. The police held meetings with the public to spread the image, which was later even placed on billboards offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of this person. But the number of crimes continued to grow. On February 20, 2006, shortly after 7:30 a.m., The lifeless bodies of 38-year-old Romelia Vargas and 30-year-old Myrna Palma Roman were found in a food truck where they worked. Both had been shot. In the following month, on March 15th, 2 restaurant employees at Chili's were found dead. The body of 20-year-old Liliana Sanchez Cabrera was discovered in the parking lot of the fast food restaurant, and her colleague Chow Chow's body was found 2 kilometers away. Both had been killed by gunshot wounds to the head. 2 weeks later, on March 29th, a local businessman called the police after discovering blood traces in a parking lot. Authorities arrived at the scene but found nothing during the search of the area. A week later, the same caller contacted the police again after discovering a woman's body in a state of advanced decomposition with a gunshot wound to the head. The victim was identified as Nicole Gibson. On April 10th, an 8-year-old boy was returning home from school. When he entered the house, he heard water running in the bathroom and, upon entering, discovered his mother's body. Sofia Nunez had been killed by a gunshot to the head. On May 1st, in the parking lot of the same restaurants where 11 people had been robbed in November, a man in a Halloween latex mask abducted a woman from her car and sexually assaulted her. The investigators' task was not easy. There were no witnesses to the murders. And what was even worse, another series of random victims emerged, including men, women, and even domestic animals who were shot from a moving vehicle. Other serial killers were operating in parallel. At the end of June, 37-year-old Carmen Miranda was abducted from a car wash while she was talking on the phone with her boyfriend, who heard her screams when she was attacked. The assailant overpowered her, got behind the wheel, drove about 100 meters, and parked behind a barbershop, where the woman was later found with a gunshot wound to the forehead. This attack was captured on surveillance camera, but the image was too grainy to identify the assailant. At this time, the perpetrator was renamed the Baseline Killer. At this point, you are probably wondering, as I am, with so many sexual assaults, why was no mention made of DNA samples for identifying the perpetrator? In the subsequent court case in the higher instance, it was alleged that the police department had not conducted timely testing of available DNA samples. Perhaps that was partly true. As with the arrival of summer, the detectives leading the case began insisting on more urgent processing of DNA evidence. It became known that investigators had found DNA on the chest of a girl who had been assaulted in the presence of her pregnant sister. The Phoenix lab specialists immediately took a sample from the left breast, which was contaminated, but they managed to preserve it. However, after analyzing it, they concluded that it was insufficient for identifying a suspect. This and other samples were sent to the Arizona State Crime Lab, which had more resources than the city lab in Phoenix. A list of 75 potential suspects was also sent there. Meanwhile, a state prison investigator contacted the task force on the case and reported that a certain woman claimed she had seen the Baseline Killer's composite sketch and knew who he was. She identified him as Mark Gudo. The woman who called turned out to be Darlene, for whose rape he had first ended up behind bars. Orders were given to locate the man and place him under surveillance. On July 21, 2006, a detective and a probation officer visited Mark, and he agreed to provide the requested fingerprints and DNA samples. Ballistics experts were able to analyze the bullets and casings found at crime scenes and on victims, establishing that all had been fired from the same weapon, a .38 caliber pistol. This confirmed that all these cases were linked and that one and the same person was responsible. Finally, experts from the Arizona State Crime Lab analyzed the sample taken from the left breast and, using a new procedure, were able to isolate and identify male DNA. On September 2, 2006, they notified the Phoenix police that the genetic sample belonged to Mark Gudo. Subsequently, this same profile would match other rape victims. On September 6th, on his 42nd birthday, Gudo was arrested without resistance in front of his home. Initially, he was arrested for the rape of one of the sisters, and over time, charges were expanded to include several other sexual assault cases. Most of the assaults were committed within a perimeter of about 4 kilometers around Mark's home. Investigators conducted several searches of Gudo's home. Among the first items seized was a pair of white sneakers that caught the police's attention, as many victims had referenced the assailant wearing white or black shoes. Despite the shoes having been washed, examination revealed DNA from 2 murdered victims, one belonging to the only male victim, Chow Chow, and the other to Nicole Gibson, killed in late March 2005. The lead detective on the case was dissatisfied that only the white sneakers had been seized, suspecting that other footwear might contain more evidence. Since nearly all of Gudo's victims had been shot at close range, based on evidence from the first pair of shoes, a warrant was issued for a second search of Mark's home. The task of collecting and analyzing the remaining shoes became titanic, as Gudo had dozens of pairs. But the work paid off. Inside a brown leather boot and in a sealed plastic sandwich bag, some clothing items were found, including a ring and bracelet belonging to Tina Washington. After Mark Gudo's arrest, his wife Wendy Carr became his main defender, claiming that the Phoenix police's conclusions were lies and that officials had planted evidence found in their home to frame her husband and gain fame by solving one of Arizona's most shocking criminal cases. But the Phoenix police published hundreds of pages detailing all the steps taken during the baseline killer investigation. It became known that investigators had at least 10 suspects, but further investigation had already ruled out several people. Mark Gudo's name appears in these documents, though only in rare mentions. The Phoenix police presented Mark Gudo with 74 charges, including 9 counts of first-degree murder, including the murder of Sofia Nunez on April 10, 2006, who, as it turned out, knew her attacker because he had installed a surveillance system in her home. In addition, 5 sexual assaults and 3 attempted sexual assaults, 10 kidnapping episodes, 12 armed robberies, for attempted armed robberies, 3 sexual assaults, 9 crimes against minors, 13 aggravated assaults, and 3 counts of indecent conduct. In March 2017, the prosecution announced it would seek the death penalty for Gudo and claimed that the murdered women had not allowed themselves to be raped. The trial against Mark was held in 2 separate court sessions, one in 2007 and the other in 2011. Virtually the only thing the defense contested was the legality of the search of the defendant's home, implying that the evidence found there had been planted by the police. By the end of both trials, Mark Gudo was found guilty of 76 crimes against 9 victims. For this, he received 16 life sentences plus 34 years, as well as a death sentence for each of the 9 murders. Currently, Mark Gudo is on death row in the state of Arizona. Other serial killers operating in parallel with Mark Gudo were Dale Hausner and Samuel Diedemann. They committed the vast majority of their crimes by shooting from a moving vehicle, apparently driven by sport. They were also arsonists and contract killers. From May 2005 to August 2006, they killed 8 people in at least 9 shootouts, allegedly under the influence of prohibited substances. As a result, many people and domestic animals were harmed, and several fires were set. This duo was also eventually apprehended by authorities and brought to trial, resulting in Dale Hausner being sentenced to death without parole, while Samuel was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Friends, what do you think about this story? Write your opinions in the comments, and also subscribe to my YouTube channel and other social networks. Links to them can be found in the description below this video. We're not saying goodbye.